Welcome to episode 59 of Successful Number. Each episode analyzes the theory and practical aspects of one or more release cards. It's been quite a long while since the previous Successful Demo episode 59A. So, more than 3 weeks actually. So, with that, I'm going to give a short recap of what we did the last time. We covered 3 cards at once: Sportsmetal, Hyperloop Extension, and Gatekeeper. And we showcased Kira's deck. This was a pretty powerful and fast deck. Now, as interesting as it was, I have actually a variation of this deck. It's still Rush Sportsmetal, but today we'll be trying out something slightly different. This is a deck called Mid-Range Metal, and it was introduced to me by QVM from the Swiss Meta rather. And you'll see that it's pretty much the same, although some influence has been juggled around, but the biggest difference, in my opinion, is the agenda suite. So let's take a look at that. But first, let's talk about the HB agenda suite in general, or rather, this Rush Sportsmetal agenda suite. We see that the various agendas that we run are very high in power level, in the sense that most of these agendas that we're running actually give you massive forward tempo. The circle in the bottom right corner of the agendas state the number of credits that the agenda gives when you score it, and in the case of remote enforcement, it even saves you clicks, 2 clicks actually, not just 1 click. As I mentioned in the remote enforcement episode, you save 1 click from drawing the ice and another click from installing the ice. So all very, very powerful agendas. In fact, Hyperloop, Corporate Sales Team, and Remote Enforcement are so powerful that they make Project Vitruvius and Ikawa look like a joke. The other 2 agendas don't actually do anything when you score them, unless you take into account other effects like Sportsmetal and Arella Salvatore. So this is one very strong edge that HB has over the other factions. If you think of the typical Jinteki agenda suite with all the 5-3 agendas, they're typically very defensive and don't grant you much benefits when they're scored. Even those agendas that you want to score aggressively, like Nisei Mark II in Jinteki, and in the case of NBN, perhaps something like an AR Enhanced Security, those agendas are more attrition agendas. They seek to give you the advantage as the game drags on longer, rather than giving you instant tempo right now as you score it. Whereas HB and Wayland tend to be more aggressive. Their agendas give you more burst advantage. So with Wayland, you're thinking of agendas like Oaktown Renovation, Hostile Takeover. Those agendas give you a lot of burst money, and HB has some of that as well, as we see on the screen. So when you compare the 2 agenda suites, on the left you see the agenda suite that was in Kira's deck, and on the right is the mid-range metal deck that we are going to play today. Some differences jump out at you, even though there are some very standard things like Project Vitruvius and Remote Enforcement as 3-offs. The rest is slightly different. So both agenda suites actually consist of 11 agendas, so in terms of agenda density, they're roughly the same. However, there are some advantages to the mid-range metal suite and some disadvantages to the old agenda suite, which makes me think that the new agenda suite is better. Firstly, with the old agenda suite, we rarely want to score 2 Hyperloop extensions, right? Because scoring 2 1-pointers isn't going to really advance your game plan all that much. If anything, it will take away a lot of time, because you're spending a lot of time scoring these agendas that are just not worth that many agenda points. However, it's very awkward if you draw 2 of the 3 copies early on and are forced to leave 1 in hand and score the other, because if you leave 1 Hyperloop extension in hand, that's an agenda the runner can steal, bringing the runner closer to their win condition as well. So that's the problem with running 3 Hyperloops. You rarely, if ever, want to see 2 copies of them. The next problem is that this agenda suite has a very inconsistent scoring plan because of the awkwardness of the 1-pointers and the 3-pointer. Right? The 3-pointer means that it's, you could score 3-2-2, right? A 3-pointer in Ikawa and 2 copies of the 2-pointers. However, what if you don't draw the Ikawa early on? What if you never see the Ikawa at all? It's a one-off in your deck. So sometimes you just won't draw the Ikawa, and as a result, you have to switch up your scoring plan, and that's quite annoying. You don't have a consistent scoring plan. And as mentioned earlier, if you draw into 2 Hyperloops early, do you attempt to score them both? It's a very difficult question to answer, and this inconsistency can cause you problems when you're scoring agendas suboptimally. Right? In contrast, the other agenda suite offers a whole host of advantages. It gives you one more forward tempo agenda. As you notice on the left, there are 4 agendas that you don't want to score early on. 3 Project Vitroviuses and the Ikawa project give you no forward tempo at all. Whereas with the new agenda suite, by removing the Ikawa, there are fewer dead agendas. The next thing you notice is that with the new agenda suite, the runner always needs 4 agendas to win. That's because you're not running 3 pointers. With the old agenda suite, it is very unlikely, but still possible for the runner to win on 3 agendas if one of those agendas that they steal is Ikawa and they steal 2 other 2-pointer agendas. So there's always that risk if you're running Ikawa in your deck. This deck circumvents it entirely because you're only running 1-pointers and 2-pointers. Finally, you have a very consistent scoring plan as well. If I show you this agenda suite on the right, immediately you say, I know how to score my agendas. I'm going to score 3 2-pointers and 1 Hyperloop. Makes a lot of sense. And even if you're missing the Hyperloop, let's say the runner steals them or they're at the bottom of your deck, you can just score 4 2-pointers as well. It's not ideal, but it works. Right, so that's your agenda suite. Now, going back to the deck. Yep, here's the deck comparison. The one on the right is what we're going to be playing today. There's another difference that you see. The one on the left, Kira's deck, was played prior to the Most Wanted List update. Right? In the old Most Wanted List, Fairchild 3 was the Unicorn card, the restricted card on the Most Wanted List. But with the new Most Wanted List, because Surveyor has gone on the restricted list and Fairchild 3 has been taken off, this deck is still perfectly legal. We're just swapping the unicorns 1 for 1. So in our new deck, Surveyor is our restricted card. That is why we are not running Global Food Initiative. And yeah, we're still running Fairchild 3. That's about all that I want to say really regarding differences between the 2 decks. Otherwise, it plays very similarly, and yeah, it's just really rush. It's a lot of rush in the early game, and then in the early to mid game where you scored enough agendas to get up to match point, you're basically just dragging your opponent through hopefully what is a very taxing remote, with Ginger City Grid building up a very strong fortress for you. Now today we are going to showcase 2 games. The first game I'm only going to showcase in part because unfortunately due to Jinteki.net issues we were not able to complete the game, so there's no point in showing you the whole game that we played through because it's going to be very unsatisfying when the disconnection happens. But I'm going to show you a part of it because there's something very important that I want to bring up. So keep your eyes peeled, here we go. Right, so the matchup here is versus James Gray's Run-Based Smoke. Now, we don't have the most ideal opening hand in the sense that we don't have a quick, a high tempo card to start us off. We want a Rashida, we want a Rella Salvatore so that scoring agendas becomes awesome. But we make do with this because we have 2 copies of Gatekeeper. Now, this is the card I really want to showcase in this video clip. So we start by putting ice on centrals. Obviously we want to protect against indexing and random dirty laundries, and we chose Gatekeeper on HQ. Now good runners will tend to run HQ aggressively and early against HB, usually tanking subroutines on the way, but Gatekeeper can really punish that line of play because you get to hide your agendas and you get to keep them out of HQ. Now, because I have 2 Gatekeepers, not only can I protect my HQ, which had the corporate sales team in it on turn 1, I can also use the other Gatekeeper to defend my remote. So you see I'm creating a new remote that I'm going to attempt to score the sales team in. My opponent can't really tell that it's a sales team because it's never advanced, but I can score it on my turn anyway because I have Jeeves on the board. So there's a huge advantage of having an early Jeeves with sales team. You never really want to trash Jeeves for 5 credits if it's unres, and because of that I'm able to score sales team from the board without attracting too much attention from my opponent. So that's a very huge agenda to score right off the bat, as it gives me big money. But it comes in very slowly, so in the meantime I'm susceptible to my opponent's indexing. Now this is where I really wish I had Gatekeeper on R&D instead of HQ. That would have completely kept my opponent out, being able to res it for 3 credits. So yeah, I guess in this particular game I wish I had Gatekeeper on R&D, but it doesn't really matter anyway, because I will still get a consolation prize in Sportsmetal triggering. Except I don't, because my opponent, instead of stealing agendas, decides to trash 2 of my power cards in Rashida and NGO front. Now, with no other agendas to score here, and no Rashidas or NGOs to put in the remote, I can go for the bluff play, with the only other card that I can install in the remote in Ginger City Grid. So I'm going to take a bunch of credits and put the Ginger Grid in the Gatekeeper remote. And here's where the magic happens, because all this while, my opponent hasn't been setting up. They have been running aggressively on R&D, which means that they don't have the correct breaker out. Now, they run the Gatekeeper here, and they realize they can't break it, because they only have 1 stealth credit. Refractor only goes up to 5 strength, and Gatekeeper is 6 strength when it's first res. Now, my opponent bamboozles me here, because they show that they're not running Refractor, but they're running Ngolo. Ngolo can break a 6 strength Gatekeeper fairly easily, because it has a good it pumps all the way up to 6 on the first pump. So they get to the base of the server, they see the Ginger Grid, they can't do anything, because they didn't have enough money to trash the Ginger Grid. Because they spent all their money installing the very expensive Ngolo, they didn't have the 5 credits to trash the Ginger Grid. So I'm able to abuse Ginger Grid in tandem with Jeeves Model Bioroids by drawing 3 times. That gives me the Jeeves click, but it also allows me to draw for ice that I can stack onto server 2. I'm able to protect Ginger Grid here, even though my opponent started the remote run with, I think it was 11 credits, because they were forced to bring out a Code Gate Breaker that could go up to 6 strength in Ngolo. They finished the run with insufficient credits to trash my Ginger City Grid. This showcases the power of Gatekeeper, protecting high value cards like Ginger Grid in the early game. So, I think some of you might be mystified by James Gray's choice to play Ngolo in Smoke, even though Refractor is clearly the superior decoder. As it turns out, after talking to James Gray, who is a very good Smoke player, Shaper player in general by the way, it turns out that Ngolo isn't so much a Refractor replacement as it is a Die-V replacement. The thinking behind it is you need an AI breaker nowadays. Excalibur is a terrible ice to face as Smoke, but Die-V has horrible numbers. It costs too much to install, and it costs too much to break ice, being at base strength 1, having very bad pumping ratio, and so on. So instead of playing this very suboptimal breaker, why not run Ngolo instead? It can break ice without subtypes, as in non-code gates, non-barriers, non-killers, sentries, and it is also super efficient. Even though it has a high upfront cost as well, however, it can actually make breaking other ice cheaper, because for barriers, for example, you can convert them into code gates and then break them using Refractor for cheap. So Ngolo are very good include in Smoke, but with traditional Smoke decks, if they are not prepared with this AI tech and they are not running Ngolo, you can really catch them off guard with Gatekeeper. Gatekeeper is a very good piece of ice in the early to mid game against Smoke, because it serves as a double gear check. Why is that so? Because the first layer of gear check obviously is Smoke is forced to play a decoder against Gatekeeper because it's a code gate. So they drop the Refractor or an SMC. That's fine. Now they can break any code gate up to 5 strength because they have 1 stealth credit from their ID ability. So they're able to pump Refractor up to 5 strength. However, if the code gate is 6 strength or higher, they can't get past the ice using just this single gear check in Refractor. They need a second component, a second combo piece, which is stealth. Either cloak or net mercure to generate extra stealth credit so that they can get past the 6 or more strength barrier, or rather code gate. So because of this, Gatekeeper is very powerful, as it forces Smoke to install 2 different cards, 2 different combo pieces before they can even think of contesting a Gatekeeper. There are other 6+ strength code gates in the card pool. However, they have their various limitations, as I outlined on the PowerPoint slide. Most notably, Little Engine, which seems pretty similar in its niche role to block 5 strength Refractor, is not really good against Smoke in later on when Smoke actually gets set up, because it has no taxation power at all. Smoke can in fact break Little Engine for fewer credits than the 5 credits that Little Engine returns to the runner due to the last subroutine. So yeah, Gatekeeper just serves this very niche but very important role in gear checking for cheap. It only costs 3 to res, and it's a 6 strength end the run. Very few other code gates at this strength level have an end the run subroutine. Because of its nature, Gatekeeper is a very good early to mid game stopper ice, which allows you to score agendas behind it, but it also allows you to get some power cards through, and the most notable of them all is Rashida Jahim. In previous videos, I've talked about how the best competitive tier decks nowadays have some means or another to ensure that Rashida Jahim fires reliably in the early game on turns 1 or 2. For NBN and Wayland, this is typically achieved with the card Hard Hitting News. You fork the runner into a very difficult lose-lose situation. Either they concede the Rashida Jahim to the corp, which gives the corp a very powerful financial boost and speeds up the corp, or they contest the Rashida Jahim, trash it, and then take 4 tags as a result due to Hard Hitting News. Right? So NBN and Wayland are best positioned to abuse hard-hitting news. What about Jinteki and HB? Well, they're not left in the dust. Jinteki has Cortex Lock. If you don't have hard-hitting news, the next best way to protect Rashida is by using Ice, and Cortex Lock is the meanest Ice you can use, threatening potentially 4 net damage on early turns. So this is typically seen in Mti Wekundu, which is why it's one of the most powerful Jinteki corporations out nowadays, because you can just threaten this very painful face check. Again, lose-lose situation for the runner. Either they concede the Rashida Jahim or they take 4 net damage. Pretty nasty either way. What about HB then? Well, as mentioned, Gatekeeper comes to the rescue. It's a very powerful end the run at a very high strength level, so very few runners actually have a solution for Gatekeeper early on in the game. And if the runner attempts to even check the Rashida Ice, because, keeping the corp honest is nice, sometimes they just don't begin with a Gatekeeper in their hand. Well, if it is a Gatekeeper, it has a very painful punishment. Right? You let the corp draw 3 cards clicklessly, which is essentially the same as conceding a Rashida, and then they still get to fire off the Rashida even after that, because Gatekeeper keeps you out, it ends the run. So not only do they draw 3 cards from Gatekeeper, they get to draw another 3 cards from Rashida. So Gatekeeper, a very powerful way to protect early Rashidas, and this is one of the best combos you can use with Gatekeeper. So that's Gatekeeper Rashida combo. Another good combo with Gatekeeper is actually Ginger City Grid. I didn't get to showcase it in the playthrough, but Gatekeeper actually not only protects your early Ginger Grid like it does your Rashida, but it also synergizes with it. If the runner foolishly face checks into the Gatekeeper with no way to break the subroutines, you can draw cards using Gatekeeper, and that triggers Ginger's ability. If any of the 3 cards you draw are Ice, guess what? You're gonna stack them on the server, and Gatekeeper fortifies the Ginger Grid server, makes it that much harder to contest in later runs. So yeah, very, very strong synergy Gatekeeper with other HB cards, and allows you to play this very mid-range sort, or rather rush sort of HB, rush HB to great effect. Another combo that is worth mentioning are re-res enablers. This means that you find some way to de-res or remove Gatekeeper from your board such that you can get another res trigger. Being able to res Gatekeeper multiple times is important because that gives you extra strength. Gatekeeper at 6 strength obviously is usually better than Gatekeeper at 0 strength. And one way to do this was introduced in Rain and Reverie as well, in the form of Divert Power. If you divert power away from Gatekeeper, de-resing Gatekeeper, you get another opportunity to re-res it for 6 strength. Another more notable synergy is actually with Blue Sun. Instead of de-resing Gatekeeper, you bounce it back to your hand using Blue Sun's ability, and that allows you to reposition Gatekeeper, possibly in a better server, and then re-res it again, gaining the 6 strength. Now, what's so good about these 2 cards, Divert Power and Blue Sun, is that they refund your money back. Divert Power reduces res cost by 3, which means that, it makes up for the fact that Gatekeeper is 3 credits to re-res, and Blue Sun obviously returning credits equal to Gatekeeper's rest costs, meaning that you are not spending too much extra money to re-res Gatekeeper, and that's quite important when every credit counts. Right, now we move on to the second playthrough. As I mentioned, we have 2 games. This one's going to be a full game, so let's get back down to playing some more Netrunner. Yep, you read that right. We are gonna be up against a Silhouette. We haven't played against this ID in quite a while. So yeah, prepare for some confusion as I'm not very sure what to expect of this identity. What we do know, however, is that Silhouette's a criminal, and criminal has very strong central pressure. We can't afford to keep this opening hand at all. 3 agendas, 1 piece of ice that doesn't even end the run. That's a straight, easy mulligan for us here. And we get not much better hand. 2 agendas, 1 ice that doesn't really end the run either. But we mandatory draw into the all-important Gatekeeper, and that's where the hand suddenly goes from to not bad. We take those. We definitely take those. What would be your opening play here? Think about what you spend your first 3 clicks on. Pause the video if you need to. I will be coming up with my answer shortly. Right, so it is quite clear that we have 3 things that we can put in the remote basically: an agenda, Rashida, or Arella Salvatore. It's quite obvious that of these three, the best option by far is Rashida. Rashida, gives you money. Instant money, and that's very important because we don't have any other sources of money in our opening hand. Even though our ice is very cheap to res, we will run out of the money eventually, so we definitely want to jam Rashida in, and turn 1 we can very easily do that by putting it behind Gatekeeper. IP block is worse because if the runner beats the trace, which they usually will, they will be able to get to the bottom of the server and trash the Rashida. You would much rather keep them out entirely, so we definitely want to install Rashida and Gatekeeper in the remote, which leaves us 1 dangling click. Obviously, because we have 2 agendas in hand and we are up against criminal, it would be very wise to put IP block your ice on HQ. This not only mitigates the risk of Silhouette stealing our agendas, it also allows us to defend against a turn 1 diversion of funds, which would otherwise be very crippling. So this is actually a very easy decision. I'm sure most of you would have come up with this line of play. I don't think there are much better options out there. Right? So pat on the back if you agree with me that this is a pretty good line of play. We pass the turn over to our opponent, who plays 3 show gambles out of the hand, which is fairly, frankly speaking, rather ludicrous. Ooh, that's a lot of money, but we are going to get some ourselves. Now, turn 2 for us. We pop the Rashida, we draw into a big bunch of money ourselves, hedge fund, IPO, and a second Gatekeeper. What a lovely card to see. What is your line of play here? Now this one's more challenging, right? The answer here is not so clear cut. Once again, pause the video if need be. Think about what you would do here. Okay, so the first thing you note is that we are up against criminal. Criminals do run a whole host of cards that allow them to skirt past ice, like Inside Job and Sphere Fishing. So that's the first thing we need to keep in mind. This means that if we attempt to advance a card in a remote like the Corporate Sales Team, which, as we mentioned in the PowerPoint slides, is a very good forward tempo agenda to score, we do run the risk of them penetrating through our remote despite having no breakers up and stealing the sales team for free. This is a bad thing. We do not want them to steal our advanced sales team. Even though we do get a Sportsmetal trigger, it's not worth conceding 2 points. Instead, a better option would be to play the agenda Never Advanced. By not advancing it, there is less motivation for the runner to run it, simply because what's the worst thing that an unadvanced card could be? The worst thing could really be is a Rashida, to be honest, because if it's an agenda, the only scoreable agendas are Project Vitruvius, which is fine, right? It doesn't give me a huge tempo boost, or Hyperloop extension, which is only worth 1 point. If I were the runner, I would happily allow my corporate opponent to score a Vitruvius or a Hyperloop extension, because that will take them 2 whole turns in the meantime, of which at me as the runner can set up my board state. You notice my opponent has no board state whatsoever. So with all that said, what I'm basically alluding to here is that advancing on my side, back to the corp side, advancing an agenda in the remote like the sales team is not an option. Scoring a Vitruvius, plain and simple, isn't a good option either, simply because it isn't giving me, it isn't doing much, or rather, I'm not achieving enough by scoring a Vitruvius naked. So we need to do more than just that. So one other possible line of play here is to actually install the sales team, never advanced, and then attempt to score it next turn with Biotic Labor, right? Normally we cannot score the sales team from no advancements, but with Biotic Labor and 4 clicks we can do that. So that's a good option as well. But given that we are up against Criminal, I would rather save the Biotic Labor as the closer to score our final agenda, even though our opponent might have the remote lock on us. So I want to save the Biotic Labor, and I don't really want to spend 4 credits to use Biotic Labor at this point in time, so that option's out as well. Instead, I think the best line of play here would actually be to go for maximum value, which is to score the Vitruvius, attempt to score it next turn rather, but with some gain. We are not just going to get 2 agenda points, we are not just going to get a Sportsmetal trigger, we also want an Arella Salvatore trigger, because if we do manage to score a Vitruvius off Arella Salvatore, we can use Arella Salvatore to then advance our corporate sales team for free. Now that's big value. We know that we want to get this sales team scored sooner or later, and Arella Salvatore helps us get there, and it saves us the money and the clicks needed to put the sales team in the server. So that is exactly what we're going to go for. 2 of our clicks are going to be spent installing Vitruvius and Arella Salvatore. With 1 dangling click, obviously, we have 2 options once more. We could either get some money, play the IPO for 5 credits, we are exactly on 8, so this is perfect, or we could install the Gatekeeper to defend server 1. Okay? Because as I mentioned from the beginning, we are worried about inside job, we are worried about spear phishing. I decided to take the risk here by playing the IPO, even though to be really safe, you do want to fortify server 1 with 2 pieces of ice. I'm choosing to play IPO here for 2 reasons. Firstly, I do not want to go too low on credits. If I install the Gatekeeper on the remote, not only does it make it painfully obvious that server 1 has an agenda, but more importantly, it will put me down to 7 credits. If I'm forced to res ice, I'll go below 5 credits, which is unacceptable. Going below 5 credits means I can't play all the economy cards from my hand, and that is bad. So that's the first reason. We don't want to dip too low in credits. The second reason is that our opponent only has 3 cards in their hand because they played a bunch of sure gambles earlier. The chances of them having an inside job of spear phishing at this point in time is relatively low. So we're going to take a risk and play the IPO. After all, server 1 also looks very inconspicuous. Why do you think there's an agenda in the server? Probably not. So even if our opponent does have an inside job, they probably wouldn't contest it, because for all you know, that could be some other cards that are not that relevant, like assets or upgrades. So instead of wasting an inside job on what might not be an agenda, I would hold it back as the runner, and they sure did. Instead of trying to run my servers, they set up by playing Earthrise Hotel, their draw card. So this allows us to score the Vitruvius on Arella here, which is really awesome. We do have the money. 3 credits to advance the Vitruvius and 2 credits to res the Arella, because we played the IPO earlier on. This allows us to score the Vitruvius here, and we are going to get a bunch of triggers. Now, we have Sportsmetal and Arella to trigger. You almost always trigger Sportsmetal first, because you have to decide whether you want money or cards, and if you draw cards first, you might draw into cards that you would want to install with Arella. So always trigger Sportsmetal first. In this case, however, there was a sales team in my hand that I badly wanted to get rid of, so I definitely chose to install it here. Put the sales team in the remote, and then use the Sportsmetal ability to gain 2 credits. I'm not going to gain 2 cards here because I will be forced to discard. So now I'm up to 10 credits, and I'm feeling fairly okay about myself. This is a risky position. My opponent could still inside job the server. This is my punishment for not installing the Gatekeeper on the remote. My server 1 is very vulnerable to inside job or spear phishing. I'm just playing the odds here. If they attempt to inside job my server, they will get the sales team. I'm not too thrilled about that, but I will get a consolation prize. I can trigger Sportsmetal, drawing 2 cards, which allows me to then install, if any of them are agendas, I can then attempt to score them in server 1 and then protect it with the Gatekeeper in my hand. So yeah, even if my opponent tries to run server 1 here, I can still, salvage the situation and make some good with it. Well, my opponent starts charging up their Armor Core here, and they do steal a Vitruvius off the top of my deck. I get to trigger Sportsmetal here, which is a pretty tricky decision. Now, because it's on my opponent's turn, I can afford to draw 2 cards without worrying about discarding down. But I think ahead to my next turn, and I realize that next turn I will almost certainly be attempting to score the sales team in the remote. In that case, I will have no free clicks left to install the cards that I draw off Sportsmetal, so I think I'm going to take 2 credits here. Even though I really want to draw cards so I can draw more agendas, ultimately I was too afraid of flooding my hand with too many cards and not being able to get rid of them. So I took the money instead and then scored the sales team. So, we are at the juncture again. Arella or Sportsmetal? Pretty tricky decision. As I said, you always trigger Sportsmetal first if you are going to draw cards, because you might draw cards that you can then install with Arella's ability. So I'm going to draw 2 cards here. None of them are agendas, sadly. If there were agendas, I would consider dropping them into the remote. If any of them were NGO front, I would certainly jam it in server 1 here. Well, that's not the case, but we still get the Arella trigger. So here's where we pause the video again. What would you install with Arella Salvatore at this point? We drew into Rashida, we drew into Fairchild 2, and we have a bunch of other cards in our hand. Pause the video, think about it. Right, so Arella Salvatore allows us to install either a piece of ice or an asset or an upgrade in server 1 or protecting server 1. We could do it in a new remote, but why would we? So installing ice here is kind of an obvious choice, right? As I kept mentioning, we need more ice to protect against inside jobs and the like. So putting ice there would be nice. But you know what else is nice? Ginger City Grid. Even though that card does nothing when advanced, we still want to put the Ginger Grid in there, as that helps us get the ice that we need on the server anyway. So instead of putting 1 piece of ice on server 1, why not put the Ginger Grid in there, which can potentially install multiple pieces of ice for us? So because of that, I think Ginger Grid is the right install here. And it comes at very little cost as well, because it is very hard to trash. Arella Salvatore already costs 5 to trash. Is our opponent really willing to pay another 5 credits to trash Ginger in the remote? I did not think so. So because of that, Ginger is a pretty remarkable install here. And yeah, even though we have only 1 ice protecting the server, that's no big deal. Those cards already protect themselves by having a very high trash cost. Of course, we have 6 cards in hand at the end of turn. We have to discard a card. This is a difficult decision. All the cards in my hand are good. I discarded IPO here because it can be a bit unwieldy to play, and we have more than enough money flowing in from sales team and the potential Rashida in our hand anyway. Now our opponent continues charging up their Armor Core. But first, they used Useless Wild, so they did manage to expose the Gatekeeper protecting server 1. So now they know that they need at least 6 strength on their Armor Core to penetrate server 1. So that's good information. And they install some cards and continue revealing the archetype. They're playing GPI net tap, so some sort of expose based silhouette. Well, silhouette's an expose ID, sure saw that coming. Alright, we're gonna rest Ginger Grid here so that we can potentially get some ice installs, and right off the bat, a Fairchild 3. This should secure our server for the rest of the game. Any extra ice on server 1 are just gravy. Right, but server 1 is not the only server we need to protect. We need to defend our centrals as well. So this turn, I'm going to get the Rashida going. As I mentioned, Fairchild 3 is a very strong protector. Alongside Gatekeeper, it's going to be really hard for our opponent to get in. With our last click, most people would actually play Hedge Fund here. But if you think about it, do we really need the extra 4 credits from Hedge Fund? Don't forget, we still have 8 credits trickling in from sales team. We don't need the money. There's something else better that we can do here, and that's actually to install Fairchild on Archives. The reason for this is very simple. Our opponent is reliant on Armor Core as their main breaker. If we can seal off every single server and then purge virus counters, they will be in a very hard spot where they have to deal with our high strength ice with no virus counters on Armor Core. So that's what we are shooting for here. Blocking off all the central servers, and our opponent spends their turn setting up Rubicon Switch and everything. So we are just going to fire Rashida here, fill up our hand with cards, fill out our server with ice because Surveyor is that powerful, and then purge virus counters. This puts our opponent back to square one, and they can't run servers to charge their Armor Core up. Awesome. So you see they spend the entire turn just setting up more of their board, but they were not able to set up their Armor Core. They didn't put something like a Delisted down, nor did they attempt to run our centrals to get virus counters on Armor Core. So server 1 is basically impenetrable here. If I draw an agenda off the top of my deck, I'm definitely going to jam it into server 1. Perfect. That's exactly what we wanted to see. An agenda, and a very powerful one at that. That immediately goes into our server. I'm fairly sure they can't contest it, so we even double advance it so that we have dangling clicks left over to do other stuff next turn. So I'm feeling very good about my board position right now. I'm able to reset my opponent's Armor Core, and you saw that my foresight by putting Fetch Out 2 on Archives instead of playing the Hedge Fund. That was a huge move, because had I not done that and then purged the next turn, they would be able to charge their Armor Core by running Archives repeatedly. By denying Archives to them as a route for farming Armor Core counters, they are left in a position where they have resources in money, where they have their board state set up, but they don't have the ability to break my ice. All my ice is fairly high strength. This is going to be very problematic for them. Right, so my opponent does the next best thing, which is to play Inside Job. This was the card I was fearing all the while, and it finally came out, but I'm glad that it's coming out at an irrelevant location. They're going to Inside Job into a server that has no agendas whatsoever. And yeah, I'm more than happy to donate them a successful run here. Unfortunately, they are going to get quite a few exposes off. They get one expose off from using GPI net tap on my HQ ice. It is unres, they can expose it. They get a second expose from Silhouette's ability because they are targeting HQ. So you see my opponent's deck coming into play. They are getting lots of exposes here. And then they access the card in my hand. It's not an agenda, they don't trash it, so they get another Armor Core counter. With one click, my opponent gained 3 Armor Core counters. That's pretty insane. Woo! Yeah, not too happy about that. They also use Silhouette's ability to reveal my remote card. It's Remote Enforcement. And clearly they don't have any way to get into my server. So I think that was actually a mistake on my opponent's part. They used Silhouette's ability on a card that was irrelevant. What's the point of exposing my remote card if they knew they weren't able to get in anyway? Instead, what I probably would have done here was to use Silhouette's ability to expose either the R&D or Archives ice so that I know that it's safe to run those servers. Because of that, I was able to score a Remote Enforcement relatively unimpeded. As my opponent's size being so sad that their deck is just too slow. Actually, their deck's not very slow. My opponent is basically all set up already. They have 2 GPI net taps, they have their breaker going, and they have a lot of money. The problem with my opponent's deck actually is more that they are struggling to get Armor Core up to strength. That's the real problem. Right, anyway, we are going to score Remote Enforcement here. We are obviously going to trigger it to get Surveyor onto the remote to make it really impossible to get through. Next, we should use Sportsmetal to draw 2 cards here because we want to see an agenda. If we find an agenda with Sportsmetal's ability here, we will be able to, just advance the agenda out, possibly winning the game. So this is a mistake here. As I mentioned, I always should trigger Sportsmetal before Arella Salvatore. The thing is, if I draw a 3 advanceable agenda off Sportsmetal's ability, say either Vitruvius, the last Vitruvius, or any of the 3 Hyperloop extensions, I would immediately win the game because I can install it for free with Arella Salvatore, play Biotic Labor to get up to 2 clicks, and then double advance the card to win the game. So that was a line of play I missed, but it didn't matter in the end because as you see here, the Sportsmetal trigger did not draw me my agenda. But yeah, I should have done it the other way around. I should have triggered Sportsmetal before Arella, so that was my mistake. Now my opponent runs HQ again. This time they are able to get past my HQ ice, but I'm not going to let them get away unscathed because they do have an AI breaker installed, so they will take attack from IP block. Once again, they're getting lots of virus counters, going up to 7 with all Makua. But yeah, they weren't able to place any more pressure, so all they could do was shut down my Surveyor, which I don't really care about, and then end off the turn without doing much else. Because my opponent did not contest my remote, I was able to fire Rashida off here, so this was my win condition that I was aiming for. If my opponent doesn't steal my kill my Rashida, she's gonna draw me 3 cards plus 1 off my deck. The chances of me drawing either the last Vitruvius or any of the 2 Hyperloop extensions is very high, and I would immediately win off a Baltic Labor. Fast advance. And nope, no Hyperloop. Yes, there's the Hyperloop. We close out the game before our opponent can pressure us any longer. Feel the rush, fuel the rush. That was a blazing fast game. We won on turn 9 with a possibility of winning on turn 8 had we triggered Sportsmetal before Arella and drew into agenda that would have won us the game, the Vitruvius or the Hyperloop. So yeah, the speed of this deck is all thanks to those HB cards, which we will discuss right now, starting with Hyperloop Extension. Now we know that this is a wonderful card for rush archetypes because it gives you the money needed to score subsequent agendas and res your ice. However, there's another subtle point about Hyperloop that I didn't really discover until playing this particular game, and that is all due to a coalescing of various factors about Hyperloop. It is a 3 advanceable agenda, which is a really good thing. Because that means that you can fast advance it using 1 Baltic Labor, or you can never advance it, install it in a remote, it doesn't draw too much attention, and threatens 1 agenda point. Right, so this is actually quite important because if you put Hyperloop in the context of a rush deck like Sportsmetal, it is a really powerful threat because the Sportsmetal deck is already, as it is, very reliably goes up to 6 agenda points pretty quickly. As we saw this game, I was able to get to 6 points, and once you're there, you place a lot of pressure. Every time you put something new into the remote, the runner has to keep asking themselves, is that the game-winning Hyperloop? Because there are so many things it could be, and there's a much higher chance than other co-op decks that the item in the remote is actually a game-winning agenda. With other co-ops like NBN and Jinteki, they typically only run a few agendas that have the 3 advancement requirement, like Philotic Entanglement or the project agendas. But with HB, not only do you have to worry about the 3 project Vitruviuses that are inevitably in the deck, you have to worry about the Hyperloops as well. And yeah, the more possible targets there are to close out the game for the co-op, the higher the chance is that the item in the remote is an agenda, the more likely is the runner will contest it, which is always a good thing, dragging your opponent through your taxing server. So this is another way in which Hyperloop enables rush archetypes. Even though I scored it as my last agenda this game, meaning that the 3 credits that it would pay out, were irrelevant. The whole point is that the threat of having so many 3 advanceable agendas in my deck means that it is much easier for me to find one quickly. There's a much higher chance that I can close out the game on turn 9 as opposed to having to draw for turn 9 and turn 10 just to keep drawing until I find a Vitruvius that is scoreable, or to find a sales team that is scoreable. That will take too long. Hyperloop gets me there that much quicker, and that's how rush archetypes are born, because you can close out the games very quickly. As for Sportsmetal, the identity, we all know it's good. We've talked about this at length before. It is a decent economy ID, perhaps not as good as Asmari, perhaps not as reliable as Palana. However, the real kicker is when it is able to, on your own volition, convert the economy that Sportsmetal gives you into cards. Instead of taking 2 credits, you can choose to take 2 cards instead. And this clickless ability to draw is actually really crucial and gives it some very interesting synergies, some of which we are already abusing in this deck. With Ginger City Grid, the 2 cards that are drawn are eligible to be installed with Ginger Grid, allowing you to stack up ridiculous remote servers. Arella Salvatore is another possible interaction with Sportsmetal. I was completely fudging it this game, but the idea is that you can trigger because Sportsmetal and Arella have the same trigger, assuming you're scoring your agenda. So you always trigger Sportsmetal first, and you can potentially draw 2 cards and potentially install one of them with Arella Salvatore. The thing is, the runner does not know that the card that you put in the remote is one of those 2 cards that you just drew. Maybe it's something that's already in your hand. The runner also doesn't know what these 2 cards are. Even if the runner is locking down your HQ with multi-access, and maybe they are getting into R&D and seeing your top card every turn, they don't know what the next 2 cards of R&D are, unless they have been deep digging your R&D with a Maker's Eye or an indexing. If they don't know, if they haven't multi-accessed your R&D, the 2 cards that you just drew with Sportsmetal's ability is a mystery. And that is very crucial, because then when you install one of those cards with Arella Salvatore, the runner has to guess. Was that an agenda you just drew? Was that an NGO front you just drew? It realistically could be either. And this mystery is what gives rise to Jammy HB archetype. It's a bluffing game. They don't know what you installed. They just know that you jammed it in there, and that it's something that the runner probably should check. So yeah, Arella Salvatore fits very, very well in Sportsmetal and gives it so much more power in terms of rushing, compressing so many clicks with the Arella install. Another synergy that we did not get to discuss is actually Sportsmetal's draw with Daily Business Show, because Sportsmetal is able to draw you cards during the runner's turn. If they steal an agenda that's during the runner's turn, you can draw 2 cards and trigger Daily Business Show with it, allowing you to reach deeper into your deck and filter cards, giving you a very high quality hand. Right, so this is a possible deck building direction in which you can go in. Now, let's turn our attention away from the combos and to the runner side. If you expect a lot of Sportsmetal in your meta, what should you do? The obvious choice is to pack a restricted card from the most wanted list that deals with Sportsmetal, and the 2 of them are the hate cards, Film Critic and Employee Strike. Now, as it turns out, Film Critic is not actually a very good counter to Sportsmetal by itself, because in a tempo game where Sportsmetal tries to go fast and do things efficiently, you're fighting it with a not very efficient card in Film Critic. The 2 clicks that it takes to liberate an agenda from Film Critic into your score area is a very inefficient action. For that amount of effort, all you are denying the corp is either 2 credits or 2 cards. If we take the exchange rate of cards to be at its worst, meaning 1 click for 1 card using the basic action card, then yeah, you're just trading at best 2 clicks, 2 of your runner clicks for 2 of the corp's clicks. That's not pushing you ahead of the game at all. And we haven't even factored in the install cost of Film Critic just yet, which is 1 credit and 1 click. So basically what I'm trying to say here is Film Critic isn't exactly a very good counter to Sportsmetal, because even though it does get past Sportsmetal's ability, when you count click for click, you realize that the runner's actually falling behind if they're using Film Critic. It gets slightly better if you're using Film Critic to steal Hyperloop extension in particular, because not only are you shutting down Sportsmetal's ability, you're also shutting down Hyperloop's agenda text. So for 2 of your clicks, you are denying the corp 3 credits and potentially another 2 credits or another 2 clicks. So that becomes a slightly better trade. But otherwise, if I were looking to neuter Sportsmetal, I would be looking at using Employee Strike instead. Employee Strike, again, just like Film Critic, isn't a very good baseline trade. You're trading 1 click and a credit of yours to prevent up to 2 clicks from the corp. Not very good. The main power of Employee Strike is that it allows you to steal agendas without incurring the Sportsmetal ability. So if the corp scores an agenda, they don't get to trigger the Sportsmetal ones, but they do get to erase your Employee Strike and remove it from the board. However, if you steal Sportsmetal's agenda, you get to deny Sportsmetal their ID ability, but your Employee Strike remains on the board. So what this means is that if you are able to steal at least 1 agenda, your Employee Strike suddenly becomes pretty good, because then you are able to potentially neuter multiple Sportsmetal triggers. because your employee strike will stay on the board until it gets overwritten or until the corpse calls an agenda. So it is very good for employee strike is good, but only in an aggressive runner deck where you're looking to steal agendas after playing the strike. So that is how you should approach deck building to Sportsmetal. You don't just include a hate card like Film Critic or Employee Strike. You include the hate card, but you must also play it right. Only play the strike when you are ready to attack, when you don't want your opponent to start drawing up from the deck because you are perhaps locking their R&D, or maybe you're just looking to gain some tempo over your opponent. In that case, Employee Strike works pretty well. Alright, that was a very confusing discussion. I hope I managed to get that through. If you have any more questions about this slide in particular, or anything about the entire playthrough and discussion, feel free to leave your comments in the chat. Otherwise, as always, thanks for watching and happy net running. I'll see you next time.